I'm Dr. Sabrina Siegel with the Neuroscience Education Institute, and twice a month, I sit down with a renowned mental health care expert to discuss breakthroughs and best practices for treating patients with mental illness. In this episode of the NEI podcast, we are discussing metabolism, mitochondria, and mental health, what we know about nutrition and the brain. And I have here with me today, Dr. William Sauve. Dr. Sauve, welcome.
Hey, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for being on our show again. I'd like to start by asking if you could tell us a little bit more about what percentage of the United States population is actually considered to be metabolically healthy.
All right. So are you sitting down before I answer?
I am.
The latest headline, and this was in the last year, is that it's only about 12% of the U.S. population, which is horrifying. Yes, yeah. I know. And that now when they say 12%, I think that refers to about 12% of the U.S. population, according to this particular study, would be seen as being optimally healthy. And then, on a different day, we could probably get into the weeds on what they think that means. But this study that was done at UNC that was based on a big national survey between something like 2009 and 2016, they looked at some typical measures, including blood glucose, triglycerides, HDL, blood pressure, waist circumference, and 88% of this sample of several thousand people were, by those measures, were either at risk for metabolic syndrome or had metabolic syndrome.
Wow!
So that's where the 12% at least seems to have good HDL and triglycerides, and everybody else is in the metabolic syndrome, and probably in the pre-diabetes territory.
Wow. What can you tell us about the relationship between metabolic factors, mitochondrial dysfunction, and certain mental illnesses?
Well, I can give a few examples, mainly because we don't have all day. So I think that there's quite a bit of science that's happening now, which makes it all very exciting. So many of the articles you can find on this are new. But a few examples to make the point. Number one, bipolar disorder is highly correlated with excess adiposity, or excess fat mass, which means excess adipokines. Adipokines is kind of a fancy way of saying cytokines that come from fat cells or adipocytes. And adipokines are active in limbic areas, and they tend to regulate appetite. Again, for an example, leptin is an example of an adipokine. And we'll hear more about leptin later. But what you see happening there, statistically, bipolar disorder means likely, overweight, obese, excess adiposity, which means excess adipokines, which are in fact impacting mood, appetite, and other regulatory functions in the brain. A second example, mitochondria have noted to be dysfunctional in bipolar disorder. Both in terms of impaired oxidative phosphorylation, as well as impaired function of the tricarboxylic acid cycle, henceforth known as Krebs, because that's just so much easier to say. But what you tend to see there is that the cycle is not cycling, and ATP is not really being made. Some of the evidence for that is that in these cases of bipolar disorder with mitochondrial dysfunction, pyruvate is building up, suggesting that glycolysis is happening. Pyruvate is being made, but instead of then being consumed in the Krebs cycle and yada 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 ATP, instead pyruvate's piling up, and that if you're not making enough ATP, then you're not making enough ATP, and you might have a low energy state in these cells with these mitochondria. Also, interestingly, mitochondrial dysfunction has been observed in ADHD, and mitochondrial dysfunction has been observed in autistic spectrum disorder. And that's probably just to name a few.
Mm-hmm. Wow, it's fascinating. Can you tell us more about how inflammation disrupts the kynurenine pathway and how this may negatively impact mental health?
Very short answer. Tryptophan is supposed to be catabolized to serotonin and kynurenine. And then kynurenine catabolizes to kynurenic acid, which inhibits glutamate, and quinolinic acid, which drives excitotoxicity. So when this is all happening as it should, then you're producing serotonin and you're producing appropriate amounts of kynuric acid and quinolinic acid, giving you that balance, between glutamate but not too much glutamate and excitotoxicity. In the context of inflammation, the whole pathway gets pushed to quinolinic acid. So you're not really synthesizing serotonin anymore, and not really synthesizing an appropriate amount of kynurenine, but instead just making tons of quinolinic acid and excess excitotoxicity. So, think in that context what that means about chronic inflammation. So if the inflammation's there all the time, interestingly, the inflammatory pathway is probably there for a reason. I'd go so far as to say it's certainly there for a reason. And the intellectually intimidating Dr. McIntyre made a wonderful point in one of his lectures about the similarities of the syndrome you get with the flu and depression, right? So inflammation for brief periods, say for instance, when you have the flu, is driving a fairly similar process. And if you talk to someone who has the flu and you didn't know they have the flu, you'd assume you were talking to a depressed person. They don't feel like eating, and they feel sad, but they feel very low energy and all the things that go with the flu. But if the inflammation is there all the time, constantly, chronically, then you might have multiple mood disorders to include depression. And also with excitotoxicity, you're going to probably see some degeneration over time.
Wow. When it comes to nutrition, what could be driving inflammation in the majority of these cases?
Well, the big answer is sugar, right? So I put that in all caps with exclamation points, sugar. and I'm really focusing there on refined carbohydrates and particularly fructose. And it's really interesting when you mention fructose, because immediately someone says, but fructose isn't fruit, right? That's why it's called fructose. So wonderful natural fruit. And what I would suggest people think about when they think about consumption of fructose, the amount of fructose in one piece of wild fibrous fruit, right? Imagine an apple that you could find, not in a professionally farmed environment, but the kind of apple you might find in the woods. And if you eat that apple, the fructose in that apple, first of all, gets absorbed more slowly because of the fiber that came with it. But more importantly, that's about the amount of fiber or about the amount of fructose that your small intestine can absorb. So it gets absorbed and it gets dealt with and utilized, and then you kind of forget about it. But then fast forward to a 12-ounce soft drink that is sweetened with high fructose corn syrup, and the amount of fructose and sucrose that you get in that 12 ounces is many times what you would ever get in that piece of fruit. And what ends up happening is that all ends up going to your liver. So instead of being able to be absorbed just in the GI tract and get used, it hits the liver. Now the liver has to deal with it, and that is a massive inflammatory reaction. And then furthermore, when we're eating sugar all the time, and there'll be a little bit more about that later, you can only deal with so much of it. Glucose is one of the most highly regulated substances in the entire body. So when a ton of glucose is spilling into your bloodstream, it all has to be taken out of your bloodstream. And unless you're running really fast at that very moment, there is much, much more sugar than can be utilized in the muscles or even stored as glycogen. So that all has to get turned into fat and slammed into the adipose cells. And then you start having those kind of problems. So one way or another, you can see refined carbohydrates leading to a ton of inflammation, particularly when they're consumed chronically. The other big issue is intestinal permeability. And that, sometimes colloquially referred to as leaky gut. And a few years ago, I used to roll my eyes pretty hard when I heard somebody say leaky gut, because I hadn't heard a very good explanation of what that really meant. But the intestinal wall is a magical thing. This intestinal wall that has the ability to let in all of what you want, none of what you don't. Right. So when it's working well, so you put food in your mouth, and it finds its way into your intestines, and somehow all the goodness is able to pass through that wall. The short chain fatty acids and some amino acids and other things have to get packaged up. But then all the other molecules that you really can't use and that you don't want, well, they just stay in there and they get dealt with by the bacteria in your gut, and eventually, TMI, but it come out the other end. And that's the end of that, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. But there are certain things that can make that permeability change. And one of them is gluten. And so some people are more sensitive to gluten than others. But in certain cases, and maybe more cases than anybody realizes, kind of chronic gluten exposure can increase that intestinal permeability. Other molecules like lectins that come from certain plants, like nightshades, can induce this permeability in the gut. And once those holes are too big, once that permeability is too high, molecules start to slip through that shouldn't have. One of them is gluten, funnily enough. So gluten can induce the permeability, and then gluten slips into the bloodstream. Once molecules that should never have left your gut are in the blood, the immune system has to deal with it. And when this becomes chronic, again, you have inflammation. And then if that goes on long enough, you're probably going to start seeing all kinds of autoimmune things, what with the immune system being chronically exposed on a daily basis to everything in the world, that it can't really deal with.
What does the relationship between insulin resistance and mental illness look like based on scientific research at this point?
Again, a bunch of examples that I can give. But insulin resistance and impaired glucose homeostasis has been demonstrated in first episode schizophrenia before any psychotropic medications were introduced. So interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's someone, 18, 19 years old, who really shouldn't have insulin. You wouldn't really see insulin resistance, even in the case of not the greatest nutrition. Oftentimes, someone's still too young to have started to decompensate into an insulin resistance picture. I'm seeing it now clinically, which is really sad, but in general, you shouldn't see that. But first episode schizophrenia, they haven't been on any of the drugs that would be at risk for causing type 2 diabetes, and yet they already have problems with insulin resistance, and they're already not maintaining a good glucose homeostasis. So there's some suggestion there that the two things might go together one way or another. It doesn't say what's causing what, but they certainly seem to be coincident.
Wow.
In another example, and this was a study, 121 patients, all with bipolar disorder, 32% of them had insulin resistance, 22% of them had type 2 diabetes, 39% of that 22% were diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in the study.
Wow.
Which is upsetting.
Yeah.
So they come in there for this bipolar disorder study. It's like, guess what? You also have type 2 diabetes. And the patients in this study with bipolar disorder that had insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, they were more likely to be rapid cycling, they were more likely to be chronically symptomatic, and they were more likely to be lithium refractory. So again, couldn't really say can't prove what's causing what, but this seems to be quite a coincidence that when this bipolar disorder and insulin resistance is together, it seems to be much more severe.
Right. What is really going on when we say that we are hangry?
I'm so glad you asked. Do you ever get hangry?
Yeah, I use that term a lot.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's good of you to admit it. Hangry is interesting to me because that's basically Snickers' entire advertising campaign, right? And I love it. It's especially the ones with Danny Trejo. It's a really well done ad. But as a physician, it bothers me that hangry is a hypoglycemic episode.
Right.
So it's not cute. And TV's making it cute. But that's a pathologic state. And that, in my adventures kind of learning about all this, I caught on to something that was, I believe the term was coined by a doctor named Timothy Noakes in South Africa, who is also the guy that wrote the book on long distance running. So a really, really interesting fellow. But he came up with this idea of the central governor model. And what he meant by that is that the brain controls everything. And when it specifically came up because marathon runners, they get around mile 18 and they get this thing called bonking. Have you heard that before?
Right. Yep.
And
Hitting the wall.
Yeah, and they're all terrified of it. It's like the thing of myth. And I don't blame them, because when they do it, they're done. They got 18 miles and they only have 8 to go, and they're on the ground. I mean, they can't get up. And that's the end of it. And it was Dr. Noakes, I think, who really elucidated that it's not your legs that failed you, it's your brain. So the muscles and the bones and every other part of your body probably could have kept running, but your brain had an energy crisis and decided that you're done, because that's what the brain will do. The brain will do what it needs to do to protect itself. So going back now to people having hangry episodes, when someone is insulin resistant, and also typically leptin resistant, right? So I said I'd get back to leptin. Leptin being that adipokine that is released from adipose cells to tell your brain that you have enough. That's literally what that means. So the more adiposity that you have, the more leptin is going to your brain, telling your brain that you have all sorts of stored energy, maybe more than you need. So when you get a certain amount of leptin, you don't feel like eating anymore. But an insulin resistant person can also become leptin resistant, so that the brain is not responsive to leptin. And I heard a lecture once where someone suggested that the brain is literally blind to your body fat at that point. So imagine the brain trying to think about energy management, and the brain sees your blood glucose, which is about a teaspoon at any given moment, and it sees your glycogen, which under certain circumstances would be mere hours of fuel. That's all you have. And the brain thinks that's all you have. And if the brain runs out of energy, if the brain literally runs out of ATP, the lights go out and they don't come back on. So that when the brain is managing energy, this is a life and death kind of thing. And if it can't see your body fat, it thinks you're going to die multiple times a day. So when I say it like that, now you see what hangry is. That is where the blood glucose is starting to dip and the resources are looking thin. If you have 10 pounds of fat on your body, which anybody with 20 pounds or 30 pounds of fat on their body, like a 200-pound person, would still be, you could see most of their abdominal muscles. So that's someone who's really, really, really thin at about 200 pounds could have 20 or 30 pounds of fat on their body, no problem. And 10 pounds of fat is about 35,000 calories that your brain could use for fuel. So if your brain knew it was there, you'd never be hangry. That wouldn't exist, because there would never be a fuel crisis. But when your brain is blind to it and it thinks that death is imminent, then people have that. They're anxious, they're irritable, they feel shaky, they feel physically ill. And you'll also typically find when someone is hangry, they will literally put anything in their mouth.
Right.
And the reason for that is because it's a life and death panic.
Yeah.
The brain is screaming at you, saying, put something in the mouth right now, and we'll worry about the consequences later once we manage to not die.
Right.
So that, I'm going on and on about it, but that's why I get wound up about hangry. It's like, that is not supposed to happen to somebody with a healthy metabolism.
Right. What is so bad about carbohydrates? Are carbohydrates evil, so to speak?
Carbohydrates are the devil. Carbohydrates, of course, as a molecule, are not by definition evil. But I'll suggest a couple things. Number one, carbohydrates, particularly refined carbohydrates. So think about sucrose, think about high fructose corn syrup. In other words, the things that are in most of what you find in the grocery store. Those are highly pro-inflammatory molecules in and of themselves. So large amounts of them set off inflammation in the liver, and that's not going to be the best thing for you. Now, item number two, large, frequent carbohydrate meals will cause spikes in your blood sugar, obviously. So you get a lot of carbohydrate in your GI tract, and it all goes into your blood. And then, in order to deal with that, insulin has to spike, which will force most of that sugar into fat and into the adipose cells. Because that's really more than a couple of grams, and that's about the only place you can deal with it after that. Overstuffed adipose cells cause insulin resistance. That's another one of those really interesting things that is so elegant when you think of how it works. A fat cell is always there, and a fat cell can be empty, mostly empty, so it's just sitting there kind of flat. And then when it gets given, it starts to accumulate fatty acids, and it starts to get full. Well, then it literally becomes resistant to insulin, which is its way of saying, I'm full. Like I can't take any more fat. I'm going to explode. So the more the adipose cells start to get overfilled, the more insulin resistant the body gets. Well, then the insulin spikes have to get bigger and bigger to overcome the resistance, because dealing with the glucose spikes is more important than those, whiny adipose cells that are crying about being too full. So the insulin resistance can basically get worse and worse. Chronically elevated insulin also preferentially drives fat storage into the abdomen and around the organs. And furthermore, the adipose cells are full, so fat starts to accumulate in the pancreas, which is a risky thing. Fat starts to accumulate in the liver, which is a risky thing. And constantly overloading the liver with carbohydrate and inflammation ultimately can lead to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And that now represents about 30 to 40% of Americans who have simple fatty liver disease. And that, have you ever eaten foie gras?
No.
Well, A, it's the most wonderful thing on the planet. But B, that's one of the reasons why some people really object to foie gras is because it's so cruel, because you have to make it by force feeding geese starch.
Wow.
And that's what you're doing, is you are literally giving them fatty liver disease by feeding them tons and tons and tons of things like corn. And then their livers get so infiltrated with fat that when you do get around to eating it, it tastes like butter.
Oh, wow.
Because it's so infiltrated. Well, now we're doing it to ourselves without even being forced. It's 30 to 40%. 30 to 40% of Americans have simple, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And then about 20% of that number actually suffer from steatohepatitis, which is the fatty liver disease plus inflammation. And if that was left unaddressed, it can ultimately lead to cirrhosis.
Is it true that athletes need carbohydrates?
Nope. That is next question. No. So there's some data for that. Number one, the really interesting one for anybody who wants to look it up is called the FASTER study. And FASTER, and I cannot remember what that stands for. But if you Google FASTER study, you'll find it. And if you read one paper to prove the point, then that's the one. The FASTER study compared about 28 runners, all of them elite. So it's a little bit of a bias towards trained athletes, and it is a small number. So I'd love to see a much bigger kind of piece of work done on something similar. But out of these 28 or so runners, half of them were sort of your traditional carbohydrate, loading up on carbohydrates before their event. And, these are the kind of people that would use the carbohydrate gels all through their run. The other half of the runners were low carb consuming athletes, fewer than 10% of their daily calories coming from carbohydrate. And they had all been on this way of eating for close to a year. I think some of them up to 20 months. And that's really important that, they had a long time to really adapt to it. And they compared the two groups in a 3-hour event. So they're all running on the treadmill for 3 hours. And what was really fascinating is that they all did fine. Performance-wise, they were all fine. There weren't really any strong differences between them. Even more interestingly, their baseline glycogen was the same. So the athletes who did not eat carbohydrates had glycogen stores in their muscles, just like people who do eat carbohydrates. Both groups depleted carbohydrates during the 3 hours about the same and about like you'd think. And then both groups repleted their glycogen stores post-event, and the low-carb athletes repleted their glycogen stores without eating anything.
Wow. That's
right?
amazing.
So that they didn't, not only did they not have to eat carbohydrate beforehand, they didn't even have to eat anything afterward. And their body was perfectly happy to make glucose, turn it into glycogen, and put it back into the muscles in the liver for glycogen storage for later.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that system works perfectly.
Wow.
And no, they did not need carbohydrates at all. What's interesting is that carbohydrates used strategically might provide a boost in someone who has adapted to not eating carbohydrates. And actually, my wife is a marathoner, and she's been doing this to great effect. So she has now, run, she broke her own personal record at least twice, not eating carbohydrates at all, not using gels, nothing. But her coach taught her to eat about a cup of blueberries the night before, and with a little bit of cream or something, just 50 grams of carbohydrates, hardly anything. And that, in her, fat adapted state, as they call it, seemed to provide a boost. And I really wonder if that's where the whole concept of carb loading comes from.
Mm-hmm.
That, like in the 60s and 70s, it was still much more common for athletes to eat meat and eggs and drink gallons of milk. They were just consuming tons of fat and protein. And I think maybe they all knew that if you ate a little bit of carbohydrate, ate a potato before your event, that you'd be a little bit better than usual because you had a little bit of extra quick fuel around. But somehow that evolved into eating your weight in pasta the night before a marathon.
Yeah.
And you can't store that as glycogen. There's no logical way you can store it as glycogen. So it all most of that has to get turned into fat, which that's the last thing you want before a marathon.
You're absolutely right. Wow, it's so interesting. This episode has been brought to you by the NEI Prescribe app. The most powerful tool for your prescribing arsenal is here. Based on the best-selling prescriber's guide, NEI Prescribe app gives you access to full prescribing details, including expert tips and pearls, more than 140 psychiatric drugs, and with the unique filter feature, you can identify treatment concerns specific to each patient in order to generate a customized list of possible medications to review. With full prescribing details for more than 140 psychiatric drugs, the NEI Prescribe app could help you in your practice. Go to www.neiglobal.com.